This week, the English writer Zadie Smith was interviewed on one of my favorite podcasts, the Ezra Klein Show. She talked brilliantly about many, many things, and I very strongly encourage you to check it out. But what really drew my attention was how she described social media as a behavior modification system. She said, when you wake up in the morning and you turn to your social app, you are being instructed on what issue of the day to be interested in. The news has always played some element in doing that, but this is total. And it's not even to me, she continues, the content of those thoughts. There's a lot of emphasis put on the kind of politics expressed on these platforms to the right or to the left. To me, she says, it's the structure, that it's structured in a certain way, that an argument is this long, that there are two sides to every debate, and that they must be in fierce contest with one another. That is actually structuring the way you think about thought. Social media, Smith is saying, is actually restructuring how we think such that everything is a debate rather than a discussion. That there are only two sides to every story, and that one is right and one is wrong, and that it is our task to advocate for the right one against the wrong. Now, of course, this antagonistic approach is older than social media, much older, as old as humanity, I'm sure. It's just, as she says, that it's now total. Our phones are always in our pockets or our bedsides, at our bedsides. When we open our apps or browser, an algorithm curates content that reinforces what we already like, what we already believe, and encourages us to argue with others about it. That's what social media is built to do. It got me thinking about how we read the Bible. Indeed, how the Bible itself has been translated. So some commentary about today's gospel also caught my attention. D. Mark Davis, a Presbyterian minister and biblical scholar, writes about the translation of this gospel, particularly the part where Jesus asks his disciples what they were arguing about on the way to Capernaum. Davis points out that the Greek word used for what Jesus calls arguing is actually closer to our English word dialogue. He wonders if the word ought to be translated as implying a discussion or an argument. Then he calls into question how the disciples respond. The translation in Mark is, on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. But, Davis writes, the content of the argument is not very well given in this verse. The Greek phrase used has no verb, just a pronoun and an adjective. It could be translated, who is the greatest, or something like, what is greatness? Who is the greatest, or what is greatness? Those are two very different questions. I think the difference between those questions is what Zadie Smith is talking about. I think the gulf between those questions is playing out in our presidential election. The difference between a politics of antagonism and a politics of substance. And I think it plays out in how we read one of the other scriptures in today's lectionary. A capable wife, who can find? She is more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts her, and he will have no lack of gain. The irony that Nathan read that and is married to Shelley was not lost on me. Now, there are a lot of ways to read this passage. A passage that if you were raised in a more conservative church, you probably know well, especially if you're a woman. Or if you're a born and bred Episcopalian, you've probably heard it at more than a few funerals. For women, that is. But all the different ways to read this passage can be sorted into two categories. Who is the greatest? Or what is greatness? This is the standard of biblical womanhood. All women should aspire to be like this wife. Or more generously, all women are works in progress, but we're all working toward this. These fall into the who is the greatest category. Even when we say, wow, I really fall short of this, and I don't know if I could ever be this kind of woman. Or even when we say, this passage is trash and needs to be thrown out. We're still treating it as the standard, the ideal, either to strive for or to resist. So this Proverbs 31 woman is, according to some interpretations and teachings, the greatest or the worst. Either way, it's an image frozen in amber, calcified, unchanging. Either a picture of perfection or utterly irredeemable. Only two sides to the story. One is right and one is wrong. And it is our task to advocate for the right against the wrong. It's so easy to slip into this way of thinking because, as Zadie Smith tells us, so much of our world trains us to. But then there is the question, what is greatness? I can see a lot of greatness in the Proverbs 31 woman. A lot of qualities that sound amazing. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. I read this as seeing the potential in something and then nurturing that potential. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. My interpretation? Stepping into creativity and sharing one's creation with the world. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. Holding oneself with confidence, looking to the future with joy. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. Knowing that kindness is integral to wisdom. These are all elements of greatness. And not just for women, but for all of us. Do any of us embody all the qualities listed in this chapter of Proverbs all at the same time? I think it's safe to say that no, we do not. She does her husband good and not harm all the days of her life. Well, that immediately eliminates me and anyone else who will never have a husband from ever embodying all these things. But let's be real. Some of you folks with husbands also don't embody this all the time. But greatness isn't about living up to one ideal, one standard all the time. Greatness is about becoming. Paying attention to what each moment needs and recognizing what strength or wisdom or gift you can uniquely bring to that need. Jesus' greatness is a lot different than Paul's greatness. And I know a lot of you will argue with me about whether or not Paul was great, but we'll leave that for another time. Harriet Tubman's greatness was very different from Frederick Douglass's greatness. Our senior warden's greatness is very different from our junior warden's greatness. And thank God for them both, especially through our sanctuary resurrection. There is no who is the greatest. There is only what greatness does this situation need right now? That question moves us from who is the one person who can solve all our problems to what greatness do I have to bring to this particular problem? It's a question I am asking each of you when it comes to building up our children's ministry. Not who is the greatest at working with children, where the answer in churches at least is usually parents, of course. But I've had many parents come up to me and say, I'm not sure how to talk to my kids about faith. And frankly, even if they did, all our parents are juggling all that it means to be working and raising kids and all the other chaos of their lives. They're busy and tired. And honestly, I'm not the greatest at talking to kids about faith. It's just not one of my gifts. But I've seen some of you, yes, even some of you childless folks, work magic with our kids. It's not who is the greatest, it's what greatness is called for in this situation. And for our children's ministry, one aspect of greatness needed is simply presence. We always need at least 2 adults in the room with children. It's part of our safe church policies. So even if your gift isn't working with children, just simply and quietly being in the room to assure their safety is a form of greatness. Who is the greatest? It's a calcified ideal, one that traps us in the illusion that it's all or nothing, that forces us into an antagonistic position of one way being totally right and all the others being totally wrong. It fosters fights rather than discussion. It's why we see so many greatest lists on social media. They get us going because inevitably the number one isn't what you think it should be. And so it's fought out in the comments, driving up views and engagement. When actually we can just appreciate that both Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are phenomenal at basketball in different ways. When we can really just appreciate that certain expectations, like being on time or taking your shoes off in someone's house, are more important in some cultures and not important at all in other cultures. When we really can just appreciate that Episcopal churches are life-giving for some, and other kinds of churches are life-giving for others. Who is the greatest can cut us off from recognizing the gifts and sometimes even the humanity of others and even ourselves. But what is greatness gets us curious about what others have to offer, about what we ourselves have to offer to a particular moment, to a particular situation. It recognizes that we need all of us because none of us embody all the gifts that are needed. None of us is the greatest. Because we don't have to be. Because we have, all of us,